Everything begins on a hot summer day, inside that bus cabin, and the heat was so intense it felt like a sauna. Suddenly, people noticed a strange shift in the train's path, and something abruptly appeared before everyone's eyes, making them wonder if it was some kind of movie shoot. Since that thing looked extremely real, even if it stood out too much inside the train, what appeared inside was nothing less than a goblin. And on that day, which was supposed to be ordinary, the protagonist suddenly witnessed true hell on earth. That was when several of those creatures emerged inside, ready to kill and to take the lives of everyone present on the bus. People began to be killed one after another without hesitation. Even those who tried to grab their phones to call the police. Those who tried to call for help ended up being killed instantly. All due to a fast and merciless strike that didn't even let them see what was happening. The screams of the people made those who were still waiting for their end even more anxious. The protagonist himself didn't feel like he could calm down from the fear of death anytime soon. Everyone on that bus was going to die in just a few minutes, and that place had turned into nothing but a slaughterhouse regardless of being men or women, adults or children. They were all targets, and so more than 80% of Sue's population was destined to die. Obviously, the protagonist himself wondered if he could survive such a situation. But unfortunately, he was just a player without any talent in that world. He was doomed to struggle harder than anyone else just to meet his end. In Jinogasu, in the year 2028, people were still living their ordinary, everyday lives. Two of them were chatting about the exams they had recently taken, laughing because they did so poorly. They worried that if they failed this time, they would have to repeat the year, and so they would lose their chance to move on to the next class. Among those ordinary people was our protagonist named Kim Kep-chin. He was a 30-year-old man studying for the next exam to become a civil commander and had already wasted 7 years of his life retaking that same exam over and over. He was an ordinary person without any talent to become a true player. 10 years ago, after the portal opened in SU, unbelievable disasters began spreading throughout the city. But at the same time, a number of survivors awakened. They became something that ended up being called players, even though he once dreamed of becoming a player too. The boy gave up on that dream long ago after realizing he had no talent for that kind of life. Now, he simply spent his time focusing his mind on passing the civil service exam. During his lunch break, he overheard a conversation between two people. They mentioned a video about someone named Waktan. He was a player they were impressed by for being able to fight so well. People found him incredible, and that was one of the reasons they called him God Taiyan. Some even envy his abilities, commenting that even they could do just as much for the world if they had just 1% of his skill. Meanwhile, normal people like them could only work hard and push themselves as civil servants trying to make a living with their own hands. Then out of nowhere, they began talking about how Hyachin was once an impressive player. That in the past, he took the aptitude test for players and only managed to score the worst grade, finishing in last place. He became known as the dead genius. It was a pity because he discovered his talents too late to be properly acknowledged, which was truly a shame. They said that apparently additional tests had been done, and that's how they found out he had several sealed talents. They had to go through a lot of effort to unlock all of them across multiple tests, practically giving him the chance to recover lost time. But it was all for nothing, which was quite ironic, because normally the opportunity to become a great player and discover your talent comes around your early 20s. But the protagonist was different. Chin was never able to unlock it the right way. He just dragged his awakening all the way into his 30s. It was loud and clear that Hyukin was just another person with no future in life. But the protagonist thinks he already knew that. He always knew he should never have hoped to become a true player one day. He remembers how things were 7 years ago. Thinking of his last chance to become a player, he took the aptitude test and ended up getting the results, only to discover that he had just one aptitude among the many that existed, and he had no real talent to be a player. The talent aptitude test was a government exam looking for great talent, one that might be hidden within people and would make them true players. Taking the test would show how many active and active talents one had. In the end, the number of active talents he had was just one. That was a bad enough result to be considered unwanted. He would have preferred to have no talent at all from the start, but back then, he didn't know anything. He never would have imagined that the head of the Players Association would personally show up just to deliver his results. That's because Hyukin had only graduated from an ordinary school, and there was nothing particularly impressive about his resume. At the very least, he had hoped to become a civil hunter's assistant, but he just kept on failing over and over again. The life of a talented player and that of an ordinary person were as different as heaven and hell. The difference in treatment between those two types of people was always clear. Renowned players were interviewed and received more attention than they could have ever imagined, all because they managed to find interesting items inside the dungeons they explored. They always acted with complete confidence due to the favorable treatment they received. Meanwhile, those who were ordinary people or had little to no talent like Hukshin weren't even seen as people worthy of any real attention. That was the main reason why the disappointment of not becoming a player was nothing but a grand luxury, one that Hyukin could never even dare to imagine. So he simply decided to go back home and study more, hoping to eventually pass one of the regular civil service exams. He wasn't even excited about the days ahead anymore, given how complicated and hopeless his days had become after the cataclysm that happened on April 27th, 2018. There were countless horrible events that developed since that time. It always started with a primordial mist and soul, which caused the death of 145,000 out of the 150,000 participants. In the end, it was only fair to say that Jang Nogu was nearly completely wiped out. It was so terrifying that even the reporters covering the event couldn't react properly. Fiction also remembers another player called Miss Sang Yin, someone very influential since the cataclysm 10 years ago, and now a renowned player in that world to the point of giving regular interviews. In this interview, Sang-gun claims that after so much time in the field, he had enough experience. He could say with full confidence that effort was always more important than talent, and he asked everyone to keep their eyes on him during that time, because he intended to keep growing stronger and stronger. Kakshin wonders if effort alone could really take someone to that level, and whether his own efforts simply hadn't been enough to get him there. The protagonist sighs and thinks he shouldn't be dwelling on pointless things. Surely there was no reason to focus his thoughts on the impossible now. Hishin thinks that if he had even a bit of talent, he might have awakened as a real player. Maybe he would have been chosen by a guardian, able to make his own fortune. Hukshin is surprised that even now, after so many years, he still had a bit of hope. But in the end, it was all his fault that things ended up in such a chaotic way. The fact that his mother died from her own illness. How his sister ended up working at a semiconductor factory so they could escape poverty. She went on to develop leukemia. And so many other things were also his fault. Fiction thinks that even if he could succeed for the sake of his family, he was still someone without talent, money, or anything truly valuable. He failed the civil service exams multiple times. They never found out why or exactly what he was doing so wrong. After ending up receiving attention just for being so utterly incompetent, he wonders when exactly things began to go wrong in his life. Hin always believed he gave his all to achieve his goals. But in the end, that certainly wasn't the case. He asked himself if anything might have changed had he tried harder to reach his goals. But if things continued as they were now for the rest of his life, he didn't even know exactly what he should do anymore. Hakshin ended up feeling quite lonely after thinking about all of that. With those thoughts in mind, he lay down on his bed to sleep that night. The next morning, Chin woke up without knowing what time it was. And then he remembered that today was the day of the midterm evaluation. Even though he had gone to bed early, he still managed to wake up late. The protagonist decided to take a shower before leaving and wondered what time the evaluation would happen. Then he decided to head out to take his exam, as usual. But on his way there, he realized that something felt off that day. Something wasn't right, though he couldn't tell exactly what it was. At the station, the bus finally arrived, and Chin continued to feel that discomfort. Something seemed completely out of the ordinary that day, even if he didn't know the reason why. He got on the bus, still thinking that he was probably just overthinking it, and figured he should just focus on reviewing his notes for the evaluation during the ride. Yukin then began studying for the exam, just like it happened 10 years ago in Jinogu. That was the beginning of the cataclysm. He listened to people around him chatting about random topics like the weather and popular idols. While reviewing information about the killer Fa, the sudden change occurred. People inside the bus noticed that a large amount of fog had appeared and was spreading rapidly. They wondered what was going on because it was so thick they couldn't even see outside. There hadn't been any news warning of sudden weather changes. On top of that, a strange and horrible smell began to spread through the air. Chin noticed that he had received an emergency SMS about a major disaster about to occur. It reported that a deep fog had appeared that day in Jongnogu. April 27th, 2018. Everyone was being advised to drive carefully and safely while the chaos lasted. Then the protagonist finally realized what was wrong. He had actually awakened in the past. He had gone back in time by 10 years. His instinctive unease was just because he had already lived through that day before. The events of the day of the cataclysm were unfolding in exactly the same way as a decade ago. That made him realize that all of Jongnogu, including Guang Woman, was in danger. It would be completely engulfed by the powerful fog and the horrors that came with it. If that was real, then the bus he had taken heading to Jangnu. There was a chance he might die since nearly 100% of the people who were in Jongnuva had. Touch realized that he had gone back to the past. But not only that, he knew what was going to happen during that time. how everything would unfold until it reached the present he once knew. Suddenly, a kind of game system window appeared in front of his eyes, telling players to prepare, which confused. The screen announced that the tutorial was about to begin. 10 years ago, that same tutorial had occurred when monsters appeared from inside the dungeons that opened across the world. Countless monsters began pouring out from them, slaughtering humans without giving them a chance to fight back. During the week of the Cataclysm, later also called the beta or tutorial, nearly 150,000 people died in Zhong'o, where the survival rate was only around 3%. It became known as the worst day in the history of mankind. But after that incident, the beings known as players emerged in the world. They quickly subdued the monsters. The catastrophic dungeons in Zhong'o were slowly cleared by their hands. Invasions from different dungeons were marked by major battles between players throughout history. Recordings were made in order to be used for the creation of virtual dungeons. And so, the world began to slowly reorganize itself after the Great Disaster. The protagonist had memorized each of those dungeon recordings at the time and watched them all. He completed those virtual dungeons hundreds of times, driven by his fascination and desire to become a player. In fact, it would be hard to find anyone who knew more about those incidents than him. Even if he was never able to become a real player, he memorized every one of those useless dungeon raids and played through them countless times. And it was in those moments that Hyukin showed his potential and became the best player in the world, even if it was only inside the virtual world. Back in the present, the tutorial was about to begin. The system window warned all players to prepare themselves. Hakshin knew those notifications would appear during the Cataclysm. He had only ever heard about them in theory, but seeing them live was far different from what he expected. Suddenly, the bus crashed into something, and all the passengers were shaken. After all, they couldn't even see what was outside the bus, and they began to worry that something serious might be happening. Shin tried to stay calm. Those were events that had been foretold and had already happened in the past. But the protagonist realizes that the others on the bus hadn't heard the tutorial notification, which should mean he was the only player there. He could only survive by using everything he knew, and by carefully analyzing the situation before making any rash decisions. The system tells them to pay close attention to their actions because the nameless observer was starting to take an interest in them. Fection thinks that he was probably what used to be known as a kind of guardian. The nameless observer was now looking to grant him a beta opening bonus that was supposed to happen only to famous and important rankers. So, it confuses the protagonist. Guardians were known as those who watched from above the players. A player's fate was determined by the bonuses and favors granted by a guardian. Guardians were beings from a dimension above the players. That was why they always used nicknames when contacting players rather than their real names. The system announces that through the beta opening bonus, he would be granted the serene eye of the observer. Kukshin thinks it's strange as he suddenly feels calmer after receiving the bonus, almost as if he's being watched from somewhere in a third-person perspective. It makes him feel impartial to the situation. The system informs that the tutorial would begin a quest in 10 seconds, and the countdown starts. The driver tells the passengers that the fog is too thick. He won't be able to keep driving. They'll need to reach their destination another way. The protagonist is surprised because the chaos seems to be starting much faster than expected. The passengers complain it's a horrible morning and that they're all going to be late for their morning tasks, realizing they should just get off the bus and run to wherever they needed to go. But Hyukin shouts for them not to leave because that was the only way they could survive. The system nullifies again that the nameless observer is showing interest in him. But everyone stays focused on the street as a great light suddenly appears. It's nothing less than a portable opening from which a being emerges. The system names it an intermediate administrator. The administrator, named Sia, greets everyone nearby and introduces herself, explaining that they were now all inside her tutorial. The tutorial quest instructs the players to survive in the field for 7 days. They would not be able to leave that space. The next difficulty would be decided based on the number of survivors, as the system explains all this to them. The ordinary people are completely confused and ask Senior what's happening if it's some kind of movie recording, and they demand an explanation. Senior responds that they must gain their own strength to survive during the tutorial quest. Soon everyone is shocked as a corpse suddenly appears in front of the bus, shocking them all with a large amount of blood splattered on the window. Hakshin knew that spreading fear through deaths among civilians was part of their strategy. The system warns that screams and external movements have been detected with goblin troops beginning to emerge from this new world. The first goblin attacked, and the troops followed to invade Zhong'an district. The passengers are horrified as they see shadows starting to approach the bus. All were strange silhouettes that began to gather and climb over them. The passengers realize they need to escape and get out, but the protagonist yells for them not to open the door because it would only make things worse. Gashin knew the goblins would start a massacre outside. They had to stay inside to remain safe, but seeing how everyone was acting, he didn't think their chances of survival improved much. 10 years after the raids began, humanity had developed strategies. The best way to survive a goblin attack was to face them in a certain death sentence. Even knowing how to face them, applying that knowledge and practice was another matter. Kakashi knew he couldn't face those creatures in the tutorial with his current strength. Goblins were physically far stronger than humans, which meant they would soon break into the bus and cross it to attack them. The passengers scream in shock when the door breaks, and they panic trying to run, but Kyukin tells everyone to crouch down and stay put. He knows it would be hard for them to obey considering they're all scared and confused by what's going on. But Kyukin insists they listen to him if they want to survive, because there's no more time. No one knew exactly what he was talking about. They just wanted to know if they were supposed to stay inside with everything happening outside. Obviously, they should find a way to escape as quickly as possible. Fection knew it was already too late to consider something like that now. The system emphasized that the nameless observer was watching his actions with great interest, allowing the status window to activate as well as the inventory. The protagonist was surprised to see the status window and realized that all of his points were ridiculously high, considering that even the best players at the beginning only had 9 points, while he now had 11 points right in the tutorial. The passengers screamed again as the goblins began smashing the windows to get inside. Soon, one of them was pierced by a goblin's weapon while still crying out for help. A chaotic scene began inside the bus, and Hyukin lay down on the floor, blending in with the bodies, using the Bedabanist to keep calm, which was working perfectly. The protagonist knew there were some survival conditions within the safe zone during the tutorial. One of them was inside the bus and to meet the safety conditions. For the sake of survival, he needed to stay calm. Hai-Chin was worried that any movement could bring his survival plan to an end, but somehow he still managed to stay calm enough that the goblin didn't notice him. He thought it was all thanks to the bonus he had received from the Guardian. Even though he didn't know why he got the bonus, he was able to use it to survive. Hai thought that if his knowledge about the future was correct, that the first wave of attacks would continue for a long 10 minutes. It would take only a few more minutes for them to finish the wave. He just needed to survive a little longer during that short period of time. It was hard even for Hyukin to remain completely calm when the goblins touched him. He tried to stay as still as possible so he could make the most of every second. The system notified that the brave Lion King had given Hyukin a chance, which surprised the protagonist because it was a different Guardian who decided to help him. That Guardian chose to give him something called a high-potency elixir. The Guardian gave it eagerly, wanting to see how far Hyukin's courage could still go. That elixir was a gift that could be used for 10 minutes. Temporarily increasing his strength by 6 points. Hai realized that he had received multiple things even during the tutorial. When a player increased their skills and leveled up, they would get a status boost. Taking that elixir would be the equivalent of boosting his physical strength by 3 levels. Knowing this, Gashin thought he could fight the goblins now, having enough power to beat them using that elixir. Tekken knew that the Guardian who gave him the elixir probably wanted to see him fight. Putting his courage on the line, he mentally complained because those Guardians were being arrogant for expecting him to simply agree to their request. Geeksha knew there were only a few seconds left before the raid ended. It could survive without doing anything too risky. At that point, the brave Lion King wanted to begin a negotiation with the intermediate administrator and so stated that according to the Guardian's requests, the tutorial field would be altered. Hyukin realized the Guardian was trying any means necessary to make him fight. Among the many Guardians, the brave Lion King was especially infamous. He was a Guardian fascinated by reckless courage, the spirit of challenge, and the useless passion of players. Unfortunately, that Guardian was also twisted. He always enjoyed watching players suffer with expressions of pain as they face adversity while throwing themselves in a foolish bravado, and he found it entertaining. The protagonist knew what the brave Lion King wanted was the complete removal of the safe zone. Senia stated that the negotiation with the Guardian had been completed. According to the request, the conditional save zone would be abolished in 30 seconds. Then pointed out that if a tutor forcibly alters the scenario, there should be a corresponding reward given to the player affected by it. They were trying to force him to stay quiet and be satisfied with just his strength-boosting elixir. He said SA couldn't overlook the rules, especially if his life was at stake. That it wasn't right to ignore the commandments, which surprised the administrator. The nameless observer was equally impressed, but the brave Lion King fell silent. Senna asked about the commandments he mentioned. The protagonist said it was an irrational complaint just like that, thinking it was normal for them to be surprised. After all, the laws and commandments weren't even discovered until 7 years after the tutorial. Senna asked how he knew about the commandments, and he dodged the question, saying it wasn't important. After all, there was no need for a player to explain to anyone how to play the game, which silenced her. The protagonist also says that they've already spent 10 seconds talking, which means 10 seconds of his time in the safe zone were gone. She would need to find a way to make up for the time they lost there. Cinia agrees that Cookin is right. In accordance with the commandments, she extends the safe zone time by another 10 seconds. In addition, she will compensate him with something related to the change in scenario. Chin receives a quality lubricant. It was an item that could be used to enhance the sharpness of blades or used in other applications as well. He also receives a rusty steel sword that couldn't cause much lethality, but it had an attack power ranging between 2 and 5 points. The protagonist realizes he couldn't complain anymore. At least he's satisfied because he managed to get something. All because he mentioned the commandments. When he returns, the goblin invasion wave is over and everyone exits the bus. Thanks to that conversation, he had an easy time using the safe zone condition and was able to survive without having to fight the monsters. The system alerts that the brave Lion King is disappointed, but the protagonist couldn't care less. He ends up seeing the bodies of all the passengers on the ground and almost vomits. Trying to stay strong and calm himself, he needed to focus on continuing to survive. Chuch knows that the tutorial week is a living hell, but if he wanted to survive through that period, he would need to go out in search of water and food. So the protagonist leaves the bus heading to the nearest convenience store about 300 meters away as his top priority. Chin was aware of it because he had studied that area for 3 years. So he knew the space very well, but given the short amount of time, he had to move quickly or he'd end up caught defenseless. Meanwhile, a man screamed for help because there were injured people nearby. He needed assistance, and although Hyukin was aware of them, he couldn't tell exactly where they were. Considering the fog still obscured most of his vision, Hyukshin decides to use the bus he had been in as a reference point. Even then, it was hard to tell where he needed to go, especially while trying to avoid detours. He wonders if it's because he's still under the Guardian's bonus that he can remain this calm, even with all the destruction and dead bodies scattered everywhere, until suddenly he gets startled by an arm under the car. He almost thinks it's just another corpse until he hears a voice asking for help. Gekshin notices a survivor and approaches to get a closer look. On the other side of the car, there's a goblin also lying underneath. Apparently, some kind of mistake happened. Despite the raid retreat order when it ended, for some reason, this one ended up stuck there. The goblin was laughing and preparing to take the life of the woman who was trapped. She begs Fiction to save her. She doesn't want to die yet because she still wants to see her mother. Fiction realizes it's a child begging for her life. At first, it was hard for him to notice that because he had been startled by the presence of a survivor, but in reality, she wasn't injured when the goblin tried to cut her legs. That's probably because the child had received some kind of bonus, just like Hyukin during the tutorial. Instead of screaming in pain from what the goblin was doing, she was screaming out of fear. In the end, the goblin was too focused on trying to kill her to notice anything else. The protagonist wonders if this was what people normally call a player's talent. Suddenly, the administrator approaches and says that it was actually a baby goblin. Even so, it should be difficult for a level 1 to defeat it so easily. Kakwin realizes that if Senna was telling the truth, then it was even more impressive. After all, that child hadn't even processed what was happening due to her extreme panic. But in truth, she had an impressive tanker-type ability. Not even the first king, so Yuan would have had such capacity under those circumstances. Hai thinks that if he left things as they were, more goblins might show up, and she would end up losing her life. So he decides to act quickly. The protagonist opens his inventory to draw his sword. Even though he had knowledge about the fields, applying that knowledge was very different from the virtual world. With that, he decides to summon his rusty iron sword. Even though the administrator said that was a baby goblin, things could still turn out differently if he fought the monster one-on-one. If Hyukin could use that to his advantage, he strike the goblin's weak spot while it was still distracted. Even more so when there was one who wasn't even fighting back. With that in mind, the protagonist decided to approach and strike the monster from behind and successfully hit it, receiving the corresponding experience for defeating the monster. Thus, Hyukin managed to finish the task in just a single blow and finally told the child to get up from where she was. She should grab her things or he'd just leave her behind if she didn't follow him. She decided to stand up and do as he said, following him through the streets. The two of them arrive at a shop, and Hyukin warned her not to open those doors no matter what. That left her a bit confused, but she didn't respond. He insisted on knowing whether she understood or not due to her silence, and she nodded. Hutchin wondered if she was gripped by fear. It was quite common given the situation. It would be strange if that hadn't happened from the very beginning. But despite understanding her hesitation, he knew there were other things that needed to be done. The system warned that the 200 waves of goblin attacks would begin soon, thus initiating the establishment of safe zones for the players. Jackson asked if the girl could also see the system, and she agreed. The safe zones were places like schools, convenience stores, and hospitals. The protagonist concluded that, just as he had predicted, she was a player with great potential. Usually, you could only confirm convenience stores as safe zones during the second wave of attacks, but players with talent like hers could also see that hospitals were safe zones, which proved her great potential as a player. Still, it was confusing for Kakshin himself because he was able to see the hospital's safe zones, too, even though he wasn't a player with great talent, and that minification was even more intriguing. It warned that there were extra safe zones. Setting aside his confusion, Hukshin decided to focus on their safety first. That was when the system announced the start of the second wave of goblin attacks. He then told her she really shouldn't open the door, as she wasn't confident enough to do anything. She should just sit and stay away from the door. With the safe zones now fully established by the system, a primordial fog began to surround the area. Right as the goblins started to prowl outside, people still tried to fight the monsters with some weapons, but they all ended up being cruelly killed by each one of them. Others spotted nearby convenience stores and ran toward them. They begged for help, asking for the doors to be opened, otherwise they would all lose their lives in that newly formed chaos. Fiction remained still even when everyone cursed at him for not opening the door. He thought he hadn't felt anything at first. Watching it all unfold before his eyes was agonizing, especially when the goblins appear outside and struck down the people who were begging for help. It was impossible to force your way into a safe zone. Unfortunately, the moment the door was opened from inside the safe zone, it would disappear immediately. Kit and the girl could also be at risk of dying in there if they had tried to help others. He would record all of that in his memory, including the forgotten system that the god had set in motion and the guardians who were watching the slaughter as if it were all just one big game. He intended to return the favor for all the losses and suffering caused. 6 hours later, after the second wave, things seemed a bit safer. The girl thanked Yukshin because she knew she wouldn't have been able to do anything and hadn't even had the chance to greet him earlier, introducing herself as Kong Suinhua. Su said she was happy to have met Chin. He interrupted her saying he hadn't really done anything worth helping, so she shouldn't think of thanking him now only once everything was over. Kukshin said he might end up using her as bait if necessary, which made somewhat desperate not to be discarded like that. She asked her if she had done something wrong for him to decide such a thing. The protagonist had meant to say it that coldly on purpose. Chin explained that he only meant he couldn't guarantee her safety until the end of the tutorial. It was hard enough just keeping himself safe alone. As long as his own life was still secure enough, he didn't intend to discard her. Then he told her that she could rest for now because they would find a way out by the next morning. Sanhwa asked where they would be going the next day. Hin looked at the system window where it showed the safe zones, and it also revealed the extra safe zones, one of which was on the second floor of the parking garage in the park tower. He replies that they are heading to Guangwoman, thinking that the girl probably still couldn't see the extra safe zones. Even he had never heard of them before, but he still knew one thing. That was because the Guangwoman Tower was the key to turning things around in that tutorial. The next morning, they leave the convenience store. Kitchen asks if someone is okay after seeing the corpses, and she agrees. But the protagonist feels that there's no way she's truly fine. After all, it was too brutal a sight for a girl like her. She was probably just pretending to look tough. Still, he's surprised because walking through a destroyed city is quite a scenario. There were bodies everywhere, and they hadn't even come across a single survivor. Chin tells Suinhua to stay alert and notify him if she sees anything like jelly sliding on the ground, which leaves the girl quite confused about what he's trying to say. Soon they end up seeing exactly the creature he was talking about. It was none other than a slime. Hukshin is surprised because he didn't expect to encounter one so quickly. They were neutral monsters that didn't display their level properly, being creatures much safer to deal with. Even small children had the chance to defeat them without much trouble. Hukshin kills the slime with his sword and receives experience as well as 3 coins, which surprises him because although it was his first time using a sword, it still gave him a nostalgic feeling for some unknown reason. Samu is surprised because the slime disappeared after being struck, and he explains that those were the weakest monsters, but they would keep showing up along the way. So, they should always stop to kill them whenever possible. That's why she should stay alert whenever she sees one on the ground. Someone agrees and says she'll help spot them. But Kayakin finds it strange because everything felt too easy. He had only ever used swords inside virtual dungeons. Even so, using them in real life should have felt different. He felt as if he had always been a swordsman since the beginning of time. He felt familiar with that sword. Su keeps helping the protagonist find slimes, and he keeps killing them. The one he had just defeated was now the 5th of those monsters. Hin is surprised because, for some reason, Samu was really good at spotting the monsters. As he keeps killing the slimes, eventually Hikshin reaches level 2 and receives 2 bonus stat points and 1 random point. Su is shocked and asks what happened for his body to shine like that. Chen replies that he leveled up, explaining that every time they kill monsters, they get stronger. Some says she'll do her best to level up too. But in truth, this was Hyukin's first time leveling up as well. Even so, for some reason, he always felt a sense of familiarity when using his sword. In the end, he keeps killing monsters and reaches level 3, earning 2 more bonus points and another random one. The protagonist feels like he's leveling up quickly, and the random bonus stat points are intriguing. It was the second time he had received them. That's because the first king, Suyu Haiyan, was known as the tutorial finisher. According to the writings left behind, random stat bonuses had always existed, but even he took a long time to find them. Still, Hukshin had already received 2 of those bonus points. He remembers how, in the past, he had always failed the aptitude test for having no talent at all, which makes him wonder if his talent had improved for some reason upon returning to the past. Although he's not sure if he really had no talent during that whole time. If he hadn't gotten stronger, then he was certain it must have been the result of a player awakening. That only revealed its skill growth at the start. It was just a possibility. All of it turned out to be very beneficial to him as he survived and reached level 3. Thanks to that, he also gained some interest points from the Guardians who were watching. If Hyuin really was a player who had an early awakening, then there was a chance he could reach his great goal after surviving the tutorial. In 3 years, a disease-curing potion would be released on the market. It would cost around 1 billion, and if he could get that money by then, he could use the potion to heal his mother. So, he had to survive for now and save up all that money over a long period of time. During their journey to the Guangwoman Tower, Suinhua and Hyukin kept killing slimes. He managed to reach level 5, always receiving 2 bonus points and 1 random one, which kept surprising him whenever he looked at the bonus stat screen again. That was when he ended up unlocking something even more important in the system that caught his attention. It was called Party, and upon reaching level 5, he used it to invite someone into his group. She officially became a member of his team, and from then on, they could share even more things. By being on the same team, they could share the experience they earned. Somewhat was surprised to see the new features presented by the system. The nameless guardian was observing Hyukshin with interest, but the protagonist ignored him as some would thank him, saying she would try hard to work and be useful to him, asking him not to abandon her. Hyukshin felt she must be very afraid of being abandoned again. Even though he still felt sorry for her, he was also struggling to survive in that world and responded that he understood her determination so long as she proved it with actions and not just words. Despite leveling up quickly and getting all the random bonus stats, there was still that guy waiting for them on the first floor of the Guangwoman Tower. Hikshin thought maybe he wouldn't be able to protect Samo when they fought him. It was pretty ridiculous to think someone at level 5 could protect anyone nearby. Suddenly, Samo mentioned something and pointed to a creature ahead, asking if it was a new type of monster. The system showed that it was a level 3 city fox, and Hakshin remembered it was also a neutral monster, but it was a passive monster that grouped with others of its kind to retaliate against attackers. They would need to move around the monster quietly. That was when Samuel realized she could use a skill called Taunt, not knowing that it would attract the attention of several foxes onto her. Hushin tried to help her and noticed that despite everything, Samuel wasn't taking much damage. The foxes were still gathering quickly, try to kill them, so he had to aim for their necks and take them down. Hyukin defeated several of those city foxes, and when he finished, he asked if she was hurt anywhere. Meanwhile, the system alerted that he had leveled up several more times, reaching level 8. Just then, the administrator approached and asked what level he was. Hakshin thought it was curious that Senna was interested in that, and answered that he was level 8. Senna doubted his words, to which the protagonist suggested she just scan him to find out. The administrator realized he wasn't lying. At that moment, the nameless guardian was surprised by how fast he was getting stronger. Several other anonymous guardians were now impressed by Hakshin. The protagonist knew that his leveling speed should draw attention. Even he found it strange and decided to open the status window. Normally, the distributed points of a level 8 player shouldn't be that high. It was clear that his growth was unusual, but also a good opportunity he used to his advantage. So, Kaikin said they would be heading inside the tower where a dungeon was available. That's why he would give Sunway instructions once they were inside on what to do. If she didn't follow the plan, she would certainly die. Some was surprised by his words. But the protagonist explained that she didn't need to worry or be scared as long as she did what he said. Tukshin killed a few more of those city foxes alongside Sanhwa, also receiving an item called Worn Iron Gauntlets. He immediately handed the item to SWA. The preparations for them to climb the dungeon tower were complete. All that was left was to follow the plan. So Kyokushin explained they should enter the tower right now. As they approached the tower, the system announced that entry into that dungeon required being at least level 5. When they reached the entrance, she asked if they really wanted to go into the dungeon. Shin replied, yes, before the two of them entered together. They quickly spotted several monsters inside that immediately noticed their presence. Yakshin asked if someone remembered well what she was supposed to do, and she nodded. The protagonist disbanded the party with Samwa and told her to start with the goblins. The two split up so they could kill the monsters inside the dungeon. He thought that unlike a Heil dungeon where all monsters were hostile toward invaders all the time, that D-rank tower had hostile goblins and neutral city wolves. So if they hunted only the goblins first, the city wolves wouldn't attack. In the process, the protagonist was impressed by Suinhua. She looked like a genius player for handling the creatures with great skill and fighting very well. The goblins' attacks didn't even reach her. She was a much better player than he expected. When some were finished, Hushin praised her for doing a good job, and he asked her to take a quick break now to rest. Meanwhile, he thinks that the mini-bosses would probably appear soon. They usually wouldn't show up as long as the nearby monsters were still alive. Yukin says that if someone would have caught her breath, they would move on to hunt the remaining monsters. She agrees with him before starting to take care of the foxes from the neutral city. There were only a few monsters left to be killed. Suddenly, the system announces that the pause has gone into effect. The nameless observer was expressing intense curiosity about Kip-Chin, as was the brave Lion King along with the unnamed guardians who seemed to stir in anticipation. Someone starts speaking to Kip-Chin, and he realizes that a pause had been triggered in that world, and he wonders if that was the great power capable of temporarily freezing everything in the field. It was a skill the administrator could use. Senna approaches asking if he had gone insane, even though she had used one of those expensive items just to stop time. Kakshin says he doesn't understand what she's talking about. Senna explains that up until now he's been acting like he knew everything that was going to happen and asks if this was something he had planned to. When the protagonist replies that it might be or might not, the administrator questions why he would do something so foolish. After all, the mini-boss he was trying to summon on that floor was a level 13 goblin soldier. Since it was a mini-boss, it even received a large stat boost to its abilities when entering the field. He wasn't an opponent a level 8 player like Kip-Chin could face, especially while bringing just one person as backup. Sinia asks again why he would pick a fight he couldn't possibly win. Kuk-Shin feels like she didn't want him to die, which confused her, but the protagonist thinks that as expected, the administrator was trying to lie. It was pretty clear they must have a strong interest in him. Just like Sidia mentioned earlier, he was a player acting like he could see a future. In the end, he was a rare element expected to put on a great show for the Guardians. That's why the administrator probably preferred Hubin to survive rather than die there. It must be something important since the protagonist had never heard about her in the future. Sinia shouldn't have any proper excuse for showing her interest. He even remarks that she must just be clumsy when it comes to excuses. Terrible enough to be an intermediate administrator who was sidelined, especially before the events involving the dungeons became famous. That must have been why no one heard of her later on. Sidia asks if Hyukin is trying to insult her, but the protagonist replies he's just stating the truth. After all, she was simply wasting their time by letting things unfold this way. If she wanted to bring something more exciting for the Guardians to watch, he suggests an idea. After the pause ends, she could explain that he wouldn't defeat the goblin soldier. After that, he would personally take care of a monster, even if she denied the possibility. Sidia asks if they seriously intended to hunt the goblin soldier. Kakshin tells her to think it through more carefully. How could a level 8 player defeat a mini-boss? Of course, saying that out loud would only drive the Guardians crazy. After reflecting on that, Senna could become a capable intermediate administrator who could give the Guardians a good show to watch. In exchange for the hints, he was offering to help stir her audience's interest. Huchuan wanted her to make a deal with him. The administrator felt that his recklessness knew no bounds, and she summons her powers because her patience is running thin. But Huchuan points out that if she really intended to kill him, she would have done it long ago. He asks if it wouldn't be a waste to throw him away after giving him that pause. After all, she lose nothing by making a deal with him now. She asks what kind of deal he had in mind. Meanwhile, someone keeps killing monsters and levels up. The girl turns and informs the protagonist that she's managed to kill all the monsters just as told. Huchuan tells her to come closer, and the system announces that all monsters have been properly eliminated. The conditions for summoning the mini-boss of that floor, the goblin soldier, had been fulfilled. The goblin mini-boss appears on that floor alongside some other monsters, thus declaring its new battle zone. Hai hides with someone and tells her to lower her head. Thinking that seeing that creature in person was absolute madness, the goblins quickly start reacting on their own to the presence of intruders. The protagonist knows that the cleanest way to kill a goblin soldier is to watch and make it waste its most powerful ability. This was a skill called spear throw. First, they had to find a way to dodge the attack without getting hit. After the goblin tried to strike them while they were still hiding, Chin said they would begin the killing and somewhat followed him to hunt the goblin boss. He told Seiya to watch closely how a mere level 8 player could defeat a mini-boss with his own hands. Sensing their presence, the level 13 goblin soldier prepared to hunt the players. The protagonist thought that, just as expected from a mini-boss, this was a predictable reaction. The pressure from that monster was completely different from all the others. After missing that lethal spear throw right at the beginning of the battle, the goblin soldier shifted his attention to attack the survivors, charging at both of them. The goblin would move in different ways, either slashing at them with his blade or wielding another weapon. The goblins tried to strike Kip Chin, but he dodged their attacks and killed the small monsters with his sword before attacking the boss. The slash of his sword wasn't as deep as it should have been. As expected, he couldn't deal heavy damage with his current attack power against a much higher level boss. The boss charged at them again, and the protagonist knew this time it would try a different attack method. Fiction was surprised because its movements were truly fast, but despite its speed, he was still able to predict them well enough. All in order to land a counterstrike. He was determined to kill the goblin boss no matter what it took, using everything available to make it possible. Meanwhile, Sun will use her taunt skill to draw the attention of the smaller goblins. Taking all the damage, she followed Hyukin's instructions exactly as he had told her, enduring every hit and all the pain she felt because she didn't want to be left behind by him in that dangerous world. Several anonymous guardians joined the channel to watch how the battle would unfold. Even Sia was surprised by how many spectators were present. They wondered if it was really just a level 8 player trying to face a dungeon boss during the tutorial. Senna confirmed that it was level 8 player Kim Hyukin. It was an unbelievable sight just to witness everything that was happening. The Guardian said those weren't the movements of a mere level 8 player and wondered if something was wrong. Maybe he was hiding his real level. Senna thought that Hyukin wasn't moving like a normal level 8 player would. Even so, the player shouldn't be able to defeat the goblin soldier no matter how hard he tried. It wouldn't be the mini-boss who gave in from the weak attacks, but rather Hyukin himself through exhaustion. The two continued exchanging blows and dodges until Hyukin shouted for someone to kill them, surprising the smaller monsters as she suddenly began fighting back, killing each one of them by herself and earning multiple experience points in a row. The administrator was caught off guard by her reaction to the danger. At the same time, Hyukin reached level 9 and recovered from all the damage he had taken, also increasing the durability of his sword, which was still relatively weak. That's because leveling up not only improved their stats, it also fully restored their health and removed all status effects and ailments from the players. This was exactly what Hyukin had planned to use to let them recover mid-battle. Piction told Sunhwa to keep her distance from them, so she could prepare. If Sun was share the experience while still fighting the goblin mini-boss, she would become even stronger, able to recover her health, wounds, and fatigue through leveling up. Once that happened, the opportunity for Hyukin to defeat the goblin boss would surely come. He would exploit the goblin's most basic weakness, striking them from behind in their exposed necks. With his current experience, by observing his status condition, he achieved his goal. Everything depended on how many small monsters someone could kill. The more she leveled up, the greater their chances of defeating that dungeon and its boss. Suddenly, the dungeon boss landed a strike on Hyukin. He realized that was a blow he needed to absorb with his own body for now. But eventually, he managed to level up to 10, allowing him to recover from the heavy damage he had just taken from the goblin boss. Kakshin struck the goblin boss again as his rusted sword's durability improved even further, dealing more damage to the boss and finally gaining the perfect opportunity. He finally lands a strike on the back of the goblin boss's neck, but his rusty sword ends up breaking. The system congratulates them because they were able to defeat the goblin boss. Kakshin killed the mini-boss known as the goblin soldier. Thus, he officially became the first player to defeat and hunt a monster mini-boss. He gains the experience as the system announces that the level cap within the tutorial field is 10. At least 5 players were recommended inside the dungeon for that tutorial raid. The system recognized the raid as a solo raid. The tutorial field's level restrictions were removed and leveling up was now allowed. It also unlocked a special qualification condition that had been fulfilled. Hyukin ends up letting someone hug him out of excitement because both of them were able to defeat the monsters in the end. Sano had really done a great job from start to finish. The protagonist realizes that this special condition was probably where the hidden boss was located, and he thinks he doesn't know what the qualification item was. It seems like it's some kind of issue they'll have to deal with eventually, too. Near Guang Woman, Several wolves were gathering and being defeated by other players, giving them a chance to earn experience and surprising the onlookers. That player finishes the monster with a single strike. It was very impressive considering those wolves were level 8, and everyone praised him for his incredible skills. Even though that player was quite humble while receiving the compliments, they mentioned they're calling Unium the strongest in the tutorial, which makes Yuyan quite embarrassed for receiving so much attention. Yu ends up seeing Kukjin and Sunwei in the distance and realizes they were other survivors, so he calls out to them. The protagonist quickly notices that man. The one calling to them was that great player who in the future would be recognized as a very important and crucial figure. There was one thing that had never left his mind since it all began. He always wondered if he really never had any talent as a player. He thought that after managing to kill a monster boss alone like that, his only conclusion was that it was impossible for him to have no talent at all. Even counting everything Hukshin knew about the future, his chances of being able to participate in a dungeon were 50-50. The nameless observer still had a great deal of interest and admiration for him. He was impressed by his willpower and focus in battle. Judging by how things had been developing, Hyukin still didn't know his own limits, especially with so many guardians nearby watching him. Among the guardians now, the Lady of Scales had also taken an interest in Hyukin. She was a guardian who aligned closely with kind-hearted people. Unlike the brave Lion King, that guardian prioritized the safety of players and supported them. She was quite famous for giving many safe and worthy donations. With her rewards and great support, she was a guardian many players truly liked. And somehow that famous guardian had begun to show interest in him. He wonders if it was because he was traveling with someone. Now, for some reason, the guardian thought he had done a good deed by helping a child who had been abandoned by others. Sia tells Kukjin that she will grant him a reward for having defeated that mini-boss in the dungeon. It was a standard quality steel sword with average durability and attack power. Kukjin realizes that this sword was twice as good as his old rusty one, which was quite decent, and Sunwei asks what they should do now. They would be heading to Chang now to hunt neutral city wolves. Someone gets curious because he referred to wolves instead of foxes, and Kukjin explains that in general, the city wolves were all level 7 and above. Their leaders were around level 9, too, being much larger than the foxes. Those two types of monsters were good enough to hunt. If they could chase down a bunch of them, the two of them will be enough to hunt those creatures. Someone asks when Hyukin learned that information. He explains that before meeting her, he had heard it from other people, which makes her agree even while pausing to think about what she heard. In truth, Hutchin's original plan was to wait in a nearby safe zone until the first Kian launched an attack on the second floor of Tower D. The dungeon in Tower D would end up affecting the entire territory they were in, and the dungeon that the two of them had just cleared was only the first floor of it. After clearing it, the local attacks would stop happening around that area. Since Hyukin had gained the ability to clear it, anyone could continue surviving until the end of the tutorial as long as they stayed within the safe zone. The protagonist was thinking about going beyond mere survival. After discovering that he had some talent as a player, earning $1 million to help his family became a very realistic goal. After leaving the dungeon, the protagonist kept reflecting on everything that had happened. Even after gaining a talent following the completion of that tutorial and the return in time, or maybe it was something he had always had, but now he would try to use it to his advantage. Then they encountered Yuyan, who approached and asked if it were more survivors. That made Kukjin think that after all this time, they finally had the chance to meet. Even though it was their first time seeing each other in person, he could still recognize Yuan. This was the first king, so Yuyan. Later, he would become known as one of Korea's 8 most famous players. The protagonist replied that they were indeed survivors. Yuyan mentioned that they must have had a hard time surviving, surprising Kukjin, because Yuan had managed to say a large number of people during that time inside the tutorial. It was obvious how striking he was as a player, even from the start. That hadn't changed, not even after going back in time. Yuan suggested they travel together with them from now on. After all, the more survivors stuck together, the better their chances of surviving in that world. But Hyukin ended up refusing the offer, which left all of them shocked. He responded that they only needed to survive for 1 week inside the tutorial territory. And even with just 2 people, they could handle the situation easily. Yuan felt it was truly a shame, but there wasn't much they could do. He simply wished the best for Hyukin and Suinhua. The others whispered among themselves that Hyukin seemed a little arrogant considering they had no idea of Yuan's true strength. Teaming up with them would greatly increase their chances of survival compared to wandering alone. The protagonist mentioned that if they encountered a powerful and dangerous monster, they should aim for its left eye, which left Yudian a little confused, but he thanked him anyway for the strange tip. Shin walked away and headed toward Changshin. Sona asked if those people would really survive and be okay. He replied that most of them would, but Yuan was especially strong. The girl was relieved, even though they should only be worrying about themselves. Even so, things wouldn't go as smoothly as he had predicted, because according to the marked memories of the first king in the future, a certain event was fated. So, Yuden and the 10 or so survivors who entered the Durang Tower dungeon with him would all be caught in great danger. The players who conquered the first room would try their luck in the second as well. But due to the number of enemies that began appearing, most of those people would end up dead. As the time limit of the raid ended, the only survivor of the entire dungeon was Yuvin. That was when he received the title of Tutorial Finisher, the first person to clear the D-Rank Tower dungeon. But the first king's memories revealed more things later on. From that day forward, bringing people to that second-floor tower dungeon became Yuan's greatest regret. Now there was no guarantee that things would unfold the same way as before. But the protagonist hoped that, with his little tip, the casualties could be fewer. Still, Hishin didn't want to join them, knowing the risk. They might end up losing their lives during that time. Some pointed out that something was ahead of them. It was some of those wolves they had been looking for. Hukshin thanked her for her hard work in spotting the creatures from so far away and suggested they go hunt them immediately. The two charged at the wolves, and Sunwood used her taunt skill so she could swing her baseball bat, doing exactly what she knew she had to do in order to face the creatures as effective bait. Chun would keep doing what was necessary as well, not just clearing dungeons in the tutorial, but taking advantage of the condition that there were no more level restrictions inside the tutorial. As long as those conditions held, he would take the opportunity to go beyond level 10. Chin and Samoa killed several of the neutral city wolves. The girl realized that the baseball bat was much more comfortable to use than her bare fists. It had really been a good idea to follow Hukshin's suggestions and pick up that weapon for battles. Meanwhile, Hukshin kept defeating the monsters as well, finally reaching level 11 and becoming the first player to achieve that milestone. Someone thinks it was only natural for that to happen. It was already hard enough for other people to even reach level 10 that quickly. But Hukshin did it and also receive a new title called the First Pioneer, which makes him wonder what exactly was going on. The First Pioneer was an honorable title granted to those who were trailblazers and reached new territories. It granted an extra 20% experience and could also be applied to other titles. He actually is surprised because the conditions for that title were truly amazing. Even though he had never heard of such a title before, it was curious that there was a different title available besides Tutorial Finisher. Still, it made some sense considering the level restriction had been removed. Unlike the first time, no one could have claimed it before. It made sense that no one knew about that title. Some asks if Huan is okay, and he just replies that they should keep going and find more monsters to defeat with their own hands. The administrator simply watches them while speaking with the guardians. Senna says that, just as she suspected, she discovered something and would report it and ask for confirmation. She seemed pretty irritated with what she had just found out. In the safe zone inside the hospital, Hukshin and Samwa prepared to begin the new invasion and expedition. The protagonist notices that something had made Senna angry since the day before. He's surprised because she brings up the title he received. Gekken agrees that he did indeed get one, and Senna asks which title it was, but he refuses to say. Even the Guardians wouldn't know what the player's title was unless he said it out loud. There was a lot of pressure on her shoulders now, because she had to find a way to discover it. Chin was aware of that, knowing she must be in trouble. There was no need for him to say anything specific this time. Maybe it was better to keep the spectators curious. Sa asks if they're going to Chien again like last time. And Hyukin agrees, because they'd be heading there again the next day. Meanwhile, near Jim Wong Woman, Yuan decides to announce something to everyone who was following him. He says that maybe they had already heard about it before, but they had information about a dungeon nearby. They didn't know how dangerous it might be inside that dungeon. There was no denying that after the big change in that world, great rewards awaited them. Yuan declares that he would like to enter that dungeon. Several other people say that if he's going in, then they'd like to go in too. They want to help him earn a good opportunity to overcome the dangers that awaited. Yuan shouts for everyone to get excited about advancing into the dungeon and to prepare themselves to beat it, making everyone determined to achieve victory. Meanwhile, in Xi'an, Hukshin and Samwa continue killing wolves from the neutral zone and gaining experience. The girl mentions that they've been able to hunt those monsters really quickly since then. The protagonist explains that it was because they had killed them over and over again. That was the second day in a row they'd been in the city just hunting those wolves, and Hyukin had managed to reach level 12 in the blink of an eye. That way, they could hunt them faster than the monsters could even respond. They've been getting several drops and coins as rewards for killing the monsters, including the fong of a mutant wolf worth over 6,000 coins. In the process, someone notices the presence of another wolf walking in the distance, and Hyuin knows that one must be the last one in the area, killing it quickly with a single blow. But suddenly, a different notification appears. They have fulfilled all hidden qualification conditions to unlock something special, which makes Hooken nervous. The system announces that the 3 conditions were obtaining a secret item, reaching level 12, and hunting 500 city wolves. It was concerning. He had been trying to stay as far away from danger as possible. But even so, they had managed to unlock the Wolf King Lionthrope. Chin yells for somewhere to run, and the two of them quickly flee. The girl asks what's going on, but the protagonist doesn't have time to explain and just focuses on escaping. Lionthrope emerges from a portal, activating his skill called Howl, which affects the players' bodies. Suinhua ends up falling during the escape and apologizes because her body was affected by the monster's ability. So Kitchen tells her hide behind the car that was nearby, but she gets worried and asks what exactly he's planning to do now. Kaikshin shouts for her to do it quickly. After all, he knew there was a secret item that could be unlocked after certain requirements were met. Although he never expected to encounter Lionthrope during the tutorial, that was a boss monster whose abilities would be on par with the second floor of Tower D's dungeon. They look similar to those monsters, or perhaps even more powerful than that. Katshin could barely see its level given that his own level was far too low. He usually knew those were monsters with levels between 20 and 25. Certainly, it was an opponent that should never have appeared in the tutorial. He wondered what exactly he was supposed to do now in such a troublesome situation when the level gap was too great for a low-level player to defeat it. It was also too late to just turn around and run away again. The protagonist drank the Grand Elixir, temporarily increasing his strength by 6 points. He would have to use the raid method of the Great Explorer Jackson to win and lure the boss toward him. When the boss charged at the protagonist, somewhat grew concerned. She tried to hide as instructed, but she still didn't know if Hukshin would be okay fighting alone. The unknown level like Henfro was terrifying. She was shocked that there was a monster whose level couldn't even be seen. It looked very different from all the other monsters they had hunted so far. So, she wondered what exactly Katshin was thinking of doing. Not seeing the level of that monster was the system's way of saying it was an opponent that couldn't be defeated at their current level. The level difference between them had to be 10 or more. So, finding a way to defeat that lycanthrope was impossible. Fiction recalled something he heard in a report. It said that low-level players should never encounter monsters like that. Above all, powerful monsters were huge and surprisingly fast as well. The best thing to do was hope you were in a low-level area. That way, you could avoid those kinds of encounters as much as possible. However, if you ended up in a situation where a confrontation was inevitable, there was only one solution. It was a method that could ensure your survival. In remembering that Shin took out a high-grade lubricant from his inventory, which could be used on the blade of his sword or on other surfaces, he knew that the first attack of a lycanthrope would be a great leap. So Kuchin dodged by slipping underneath it, relying on what he knew. The next strike would be a smooth, sliding motion toward him. He understood exactly when and where to move based on how well its muscles flexed and contracted. Focusing on the shape of the shadows under its feet, Hukshin threw the lubricant on the ground. This made the lycanthrope slip, allowing the protagonist to charge in and bring it down in one go. All because his strength was higher than usual thanks to the elixir. In that report, it was said that you should use lyanthrobes against themselves, doing everything you could to weaken them. One method being to push them into water. That was exactly what Hyukin did, forcing it into the water. The monster began to thrash inside it desperately, shrinking in size considerably. Seima was very surprised by how things had turned out. The protagonist explained that when a lycanthrope falls into water, it shrinks after swelling up. Now it was no different from the city wolves they were used to fighting, which led Suinhua to ask if Hyukin had learned some kind of martial art in the past. He replied that he never had the time for that, as he was always studying for exams. She was curious because he always fought so well, like something out of a movie. He had managed to take down that boss quickly with just one move. Chin thought that if he were actually good at fighting, he wouldn't need to use such cheap tricks. The lycanthrope kept howling in the water until Hyukichin struck it with his sword, taking its life and raising his level to 13. The protagonist felt relieved because it ended much easier than expected and was surprised when his level increased again after defeating the hidden boss. Not only that, he leveled up again to 14 and then to 15. He had successfully hunted the hidden special monster and thus was granted a hidden special reward, including the title Excellent Hunter, which shocked Hyukin with how many rewards he received. The Guardian Nameless Observer was surprised by his strategies and added 1,200 coins as a reward. The same went for the Lady of Scales, who was impressed by how much he cared for his companion, awarding an additional 700 coins. The Brave Lion came only snorted in frustration at the cowardly methods used to win, and Hukshin thought the Guardians had ended up donating far more than he expected for that achievement. Even so, he earned many things from the system that would also be extremely useful. He wonders if those things would be useful now that he had reached level 15 in the tutorial. New features would be available. So, he calls for Senna, who appears immediately. That was curious, since it seemed like she had been waiting for the call for quite some time. Signia confirms that Hyun had reached level 15. Therefore, she begins her explanation about the unlocking of the item shop that would now be available. Although he had been expecting it upon reaching level 15, it had been unlocked too early. He was still inside the tutorial, which normally wouldn't allow access to it. Staya says the item shop could be used by spending the coins he had earned, allowing him to purchase special items. Since they were inside the tutorial zone, the available items were only valid for use within that special zone. Only 4 items could be purchased for now. Hatch-in size, but that was expected since they were still in the tutorial. As long as those 4 items were available, it would be enough to take advantage of, including what he received after killing all the monsters. The protagonist had nearly 8,000 coins to spend and realizes that he might be able to buy a good number of potions. That's when Sia interrupts him, wanting to ask a question. She wants to know if he has a real name. Chin is confused about what she's trying to learn and asks why he should tell her something like that. Sia gets frustrated, replying that she simply hadn't been curious about it in the beginning, then asks if he's not planning to check the other rewards that came with the Excellent Hunter title. Ketchin replies that after finishing with the item shop, he'll check it personally because that was something he would do on his own without necessarily needing her help. Obviously, he didn't intend to check those things now, just using the status window. He was trying to remain as mysterious as possible and realized that Senia must be a complete rookie to suggest things like that without thinking. The Excellent Hunter title was a special one that could only be acquired during the tutorial. It applied as long as the target was a non-sentient organism recognized by the system. That title gave a 20% bonus to calculated damage, a 10% increase in speed, and a skill called Hunter Strike. There was a small chance the hunter's target would completely ignore that skill, but in general, it was a very useful title. Non-sentient monsters only apply to low-level monsters. Not to mention that new skills made available could also be used frequently. Kukshin tells someone to get ready to leave. They would be attempting to invade the second-floor dungeon of Tower D. Someone asks if he's referring to the tutorial dungeon where they had hunted the goblin soldiers some time ago. When the protagonist agrees, she's surprised because Hyukin had said earlier that the second floor was especially dangerous. The protagonist agrees with her observation. Inside the second floor, there was a certain someone who was light years more dangerous than the goblin soldier they had faced before. Meanwhile, UIM's group was facing serious difficulties and several people had already died inside the second floor, leaving him in a tense and complicated situation. He wonders what kind of monster that was, and how he was supposed to defeat such an absurd creature. Even though Yuvin was deeply wounded, he didn't want to give up now because he knew it would be the end of everything if he backed off at that moment. And he realizes that even if just once, he had to find a way to attack and win. So, Yuyim continues striking the monster, but ends up doing nothing. It only takes another hit in return, powerful enough to break his bones. He couldn't believe how that monster remained untouched after taking so many attacks. It felt like he'd been fighting a wall all by himself. You end up dying if he kept going and wonders if there truly was no way to defeat it. Suddenly, Yunnan remembers what Kyukin had told him some time ago. Something about hitting it in the eye, or something like that. At first, Yin remembered it because it sounded like a meaningless warning. But before he could think properly, Yuan dodges the monster strike once, then takes another hit from its left fist, sending him flying and spitting blood. He was in a tough situation and really couldn't win that battle. It was probably the end. The system announces that new players are entering the dungeon and everyone is confused. But Kayak and Sam step into the boss zone, and the system notifies that there was no maximum player limit allowed. The protagonist simply comments that things really turned out that way again. The boss of that floor was still a magic troll of unknown level. The people around were either injured or already dead. But Yuan was shocked because more people had entered that dungeon only to faint soon after. There were several injured individuals who hadn't died yet. It looked like Yuan had fallen unconscious. Using his inventory, he pulled out some low-grade potions to heal some of those people. A man told them to run because they wouldn't be able to leave the boss zone on that floor after 10 seconds passed. They would only end up dead if they stayed in the monster space. Just like the others, Yuxin told Suanhua to grab those potions and distribute them to the survivors, including the man who had told him to run. The protagonist said that while he was fighting, she should tell those who recovered to stay low and not move. The man was shocked and asked if he hadn't heard his warning to get out of there immediately. They would only lose more people and everyone would die. But the protagonist ignored him, thinking that the second floor boss of the D Tower was one of the monsters he knew better than anyone else. Just like the lycanthrope, that boss also had a red name, and its level was hidden, which meant it was difficult to defeat. Trolls were famous for their high vitality and resilience. A troll's magic gave it a boost as a powerful monster, including exceptional physical endurance, considering it was a monster that didn't take damage unless attacked with armed weapons. Only players as tough as UDM could normally be relied on. But at that moment, Kuchin couldn't count on his help. When a troll charged at him, one of the wounded cried out to warn the protagonist of the attack, and Shin dodged, knowing that in exchange for its heavy strikes, its movements were still slow. There really wasn't a strategy that could be used to win against that troll boss. All Hyukin could do was face it head-on. The first king that Hyukin knew had been able to kill the tutorial monster and finish it before earning the title of tutorial finisher. All because he kept trying to damage his opponent without giving it a chance to recover. Samu was worried about Hyukin, and the wounded man wondered how he had the courage to keep facing such a dangerous creature. The system notified Hyukin that he was receiving benefits from his title to help him during the battle. He was able to clearly see the trajectory of his opponent's attacks and could dodge them easily as long as he kept increasing his agility stat, focusing on staying uninjured and continuing to attack the troll nonstop. That was only possible because Hyukin could recover from any fatigue using the potions he had bought from the item shop. As long as he kept an eye on that, he could continue fighting the floor boss until it fell. It was a battle of endurance and attrition. Watching Hyukin fight, the people around who were observing were amazed. Because he was another player who had appeared just to help them inside that dungeon. They wondered how long the protagonist could keep fighting like that. After all, about an hour had passed since Hyukin arrived to help them. It was unbelievable that someone could fight alone for so long, making them wonder how it was possible. After all, everyone thought Yuyan was a great genius, but Hyukin was superior. The protagonist consumed another item from his inventory to keep himself going in battle. Thinking that he had managed to face that boss Hedon for the first time, he knew how hard it was to deal with that magical troll. Hen had been fighting for nearly 5 hours since then, and that boss was still standing as if nothing had happened. But at last, the system alerted him that the boss's regeneration power had ended. Even the floor boss was now reaching its limit. The protagonist knew that his previous self wouldn't have even considered that the battle could be this hard. But the past was the past. He had moved on from being just Kim Kukshin, the civil service student, to Kukshin, the player. He'd need 15 minutes or maybe a bit more to bring it all to an end. Just a little more effort, and he could finish that battle. The brave Lion King then gifted him with a favor, leaving Kepshin confused. It was a skill called Superb over Human Strength, giving him a chance to increase his attack power by 100%. Chin was puzzled by what had just happened so suddenly. Before he could do anything, his strike landed on the enemy with double the damage it would have originally caused, effectively throwing all of his previous calculations out the window. That completely ruined Hukuin's original plans, leaving him furious at the brave Lion King's decision. All around, people are amazed that Kukin was able to take down the floor boss almost entirely by himself. Hushin thinks that the Guardian, the brave Lion King, must have made that decision on purpose. If he ever had the chance to fulfill his desire to kill the Guardians, that one would be first on the list. His original plans to defeat the troll had failed, and now he would have to run. Meanwhile, someone manages to wake Yuan and tries to help him. But the player gets up worried about what happened to the monster he had been fighting. Sunless says the monster is right in front of them, but it's being fought by Chin. This surprises UV because the troll suddenly begins to emit a different aura. Someone fires an arrow at the boss's forehead and surprises the protagonist. The person who fired it asks if it worked and if the monster was finally killed. The man laughed at himself because he didn't want anyone stealing his kill, laughing at Queen for thinking he could take the credit for raiding the dungeon. But the protagonist tells them to run because he wouldn't be able to save the man who shot the troll. This leaves the man confused, but suddenly the system announces that the troll boss's consciousness has been restricted. And so, it has entered Berserker mode. June shouts for someone to run, just as the notification declares that with the boss's loss of consciousness, the boss zone has been lifted. Everyone immediately starts running. Someone asks where they're supposed to run, and Yakshin replies to the escalators. The first floor escalator was a space where only 15 people could move at once. There was no longer any need to wait in order to use it. Meanwhile, the man who fired the arrow, the troll, is killed by the boss with a single move of its hand, leaving Yuyan shocked by the horrible sight before his eyes. As Hyukin and somewhat flee, the protagonist thinks it was all his fault. After all, everything always happened according to the will and entertainment of the Guardians. Players' decisions could never interfere with that. Hyukin felt responsible for not having taken that kind of thing into consideration from the start. With a magic troll entering Berserker mode, a monster's restricted zone was gone, and it was no longer limited to the second floor of the tower. There was no safe place left in the dungeon except for one, the underground. Hutchin tells Suinhua that they need to go down, which makes her ask where exactly they were going. He replies that they should use the emergency stairs to reach the underground area of the second floor. That place was now an additional safe zone that they could use. But even before they could descend, Chin notices the troll boss approaching. That must mean all the others who had been in the second floor boss room had died. With a quick move, Chin pulls them low before they're struck by the attack, and they jump off the staircase. Hishin tries not to panic. After all, it would only be worse if the troll caught them. For now, they had managed to dodge it. However, he's worried because the second floor was farther away than expected. Soon, they finally spot the door that would lead to the emergency exit. The system notifies that it recognizes the critical situation and confirming that the situation aligns with the tutorial field. It is now classified as a special encounter, forcing the awakening of his innate skill. Yakshin realizes that even without looking back, he can still feel the presence of the floor boss approaching them. His innate skill called Sixth Sense is forcibly awakened. With the boss's attack incoming, the protagonist thinks he's about to die, but the one who ends up taking the hit is actually S.A. During that run, Sama had been worried about Kaiken's life. That's why she knew and felt that they would all end up dead at that pace. She couldn't block the attack, but at the very least, she wanted to do something so the protagonist wouldn't die. So she stepped forward to take the hit herself. Seeing that, the Lady of Scales praises Samwa for her bravery and decides to gift her with a skill called Platinum Shield, which allows her to use it to block the troll's strike. Samuel throws herself in front of Hutchin to protect him with her shield. But the system notifies her that the Platinum Shield has detected excessive force, and therefore, it would eventually disperse from the impact absorbed by her body. Hin realizes that someone was hurt because of him and quickly pulls them out of the boss's line of attack. Shocked by the awakening of someone's new ability, is even more stunned because she ended up unconscious after using that Platinum Shield. What forces Huchin to grab her and start running as they need to avoid being attacked by the troll again. He was trying to stay calm because they were almost reaching the safe zone. They just needed to get through the glass door to make it there. As soon as the protagonist throws himself through the glass, he sighs in relief since the additional safe zone of Tower D should be active now. So, the floor boss shouldn't be able to get through. Where the troll tries to pass, Ho-Chin relaxes because it fails to reach them. Even so, there should be some monsters capable of ignoring the safe zones and passing through them. However, that was still impossible for a troll, even in Berserker mode. Hyukin tries to wake Suinhua and realizes her arm ended up injured after using it to try and block the troll's strike alone. So, he uses a potion to help her recover her strength. He didn't know when she had learned that skill, but it was very useful since he only managed to survive thanks to it. If the damage had landed fully on his body, he would have been injured badly enough to damage his brain, and maybe there'd be no coming back. Meanwhile, the troll kept smashing the entrance to the safe zone and screaming. This pissed off the protagonist, and he simply told it to leave and die already. After all, since it was in Berserker mode, it shouldn't have much longer to stay on its feet. And right at that moment, the troll's body suddenly explodes into several pieces. Blood splatters everywhere, finally confirming its death. The system announces that the magic troll was recognized as hunted by the almost level 20 player inside the area, and so Senna approaches them once again. She tells Shachin that the dungeon's conquest reward will go to him. With the death of the tutorial territory boss, the tutorial zone would be dismantled. Her quest was successfully completed. The system notifies that the next difficulty will be determined based on the number of survivors. It was confirmed there were a total of 5,087 survivors in the zone, thus setting the difficulty to low. Shin realizes that was still the same number of survivors he remembered from the last time. Even considering that both he and somewhat had survived, he still wondered how the number remained unchanged. Then the system announces that the rewards for the tutorial completion will begin. Thus, the general system rewards will be distributed. Additionally, there would be player qualification, the 100 coin reward, and a beginner's defense kit handed out. The individual rewards would be properly delivered by the administrator. And since the tutorial zone had been completely cleared, the level cap would be removed, as well as the title of tutorial finisher granted to whoever completed it. Thus, the title would go to the surviving player located on the second floor of Tower D, granted to Su Yugen, and also recorded in the Hall of Fame. Chin realizes that Yunim was the only one who survived the second floor, just as he remembered last time, but that wasn't important right now. So, he brings up with Senna the trade she mentioned at the beginning, and decides to offer her a negotiation in return. The protagonist was determined to do anything to save someone's life. So he says he wanted her to upgrade his item shop rank right now. But Simi-IA asks if that's really what he wants since the item shop would increase its rank naturally over time after the tutorial. He could just wait. But instead, he seemed eager to make a deal for something like that when he could just buy potions. A contract between a player and an intermediate administrator was possible. As long as it followed the rules of contract creation, the Guardian could watch the target player through their intermediate administrator. The more entertainment the player brought through that contract, the better the rewards for the intermediate administrator. The protagonist was already well aware of the problems between Guardian's intermediate administrators. And considering that, as well as the potions he had acquired, he as a player should be worth a lot. Either way, he was just focused on giving someone more time to live. After all, he didn't need a great reason when he himself would have died earlier to the troll if she hadn't blocked the attack to protect him. Kuchin owed his life to Suinhua. And of course, he should respond by doing everything he could to save hers. So, he prays she wakes up after receiving all those potions. Suddenly, Sanhua finally wakes up surprised that she had survived, and Hakshin replies that she really did survive. It felt like a miracle. She notices the number of potions used beside her, and mentions that Hyukin once said he would leave her behind if she slowed him down in a dungeon. But the protagonist hesitates to respond. She could barely have dodged that previous attack, and it would have been a waste to abandon her after everything. Samo begins to cry in relief, realizing she wasn't abandoned by him. Hyukin tells Senia to begin calculating the player's individual rewards, and she agrees. But before that, the protagonist brings up increasing the rank of his item shop and asks if they still hadn't created the contract, which frustrates her. The protagonist thinks that if she wanted the system to recognize the contract, she needed a document to prove the agreement, and that once again proved to Hakshin that she was a complete amateur at her job. Hakshin says he's only bringing it up because she was the one who failed to prepare the contract. Obviously, it wasn't his fault she was careless. He simply tells her to read the individual rewards already. Senia begins with Hyukin's reward, displaying on the system screens everything he received at the end of the tutorial, which leaves him quite satisfied. The 7 days of the tutorial had finally come to an end. The players who had survived would now receive individual rewards, all depending on their achievements and actions within it. As for the protagonist rewards, obviously his accomplishments would have been impossible for someone who didn't know the proper strategies from the beginning. But thanks to his influence and knowledge of the future, many things had changed from the original version of the tutorial he once experienced. Hakshin figured the tutorial rewards would be different for what he remembered because of that until he received 3 more points in his abilities. Additionally, he noticed that his title had changed as well. SA explains that the title Excellent Hunter had been upgraded to Excellent Player and asks if he'd like to see the effects of that title. Chin agrees, but once again decides to check it himself, frustrating Senna. The system explains that the Excellent Player title was a special one granted during the tutorial and that it could be improved after defeating the tutorial boss, also applying to the condition of having hunted every target. Its effects included increasing damage by 20%, boosting movement speed by 20%, and granting a special skill called Excellent Attack. There was a small chance that targets could ignore his attack and also increase his experience gained by 10%. The protagonist is surprised he thought receiving the Excellent Hunter title was